So what I would recommend is that you go to the practice and do several problems with the leading coefficient of 1. That is, the first term is x squared. Because those are easier than the ones we're going to do now. For those, you need to find the two numbers d and e. For this following part, there are 4 numbers that you need to find. So they're a bit harder. So you want to do a bunch of problems using the try a similar problem button until you're confident that you can do that you can factor the trinomials with the leading coefficient 1 before you move on to this section. So more generally, these trinomials will factor this way: fx plus d times gx plus e. So again, we're going to multiply this out to see what happens to everything so we can try to understand what's going on. So we just use the distributive property to multiply this out, and we get fgx squared plus fex plus dgx plus de. And then if you take the two x terms in the middle, you can factor the x out or add the exponents. It means the same thing. And you get the last expression there, fgx squared plus the quantity fe plus dg times x plus de. Looks pretty complicated, but notice that the first coefficient, the coefficient of x squared, is a product of two numbers, f and g. And we're going to assume that those are integers. If they aren't integers, then these methods don't work for factoring. And that, of course, we'll do the same thing with the d and e, which we did last time, assume that they're both integers. And so, and then you need to take combinations of the f, g, d, and e to get the middle term, the coefficient of the middle term, f times e. So notice fe plus dg, that includes 1. So fe is one number from the factors of the leading coefficient and one number from the factors of the constant. And dg is similar, one number from each of the two. And so, of course, what we're initially given that we're trying to factor is something of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And from that, we have to recover what f, d, g, and e are. And then we just, as last time, we just write it in that form, and it'll be factored. So we have to figure out what those 4 numbers are. Okay, so I just wrote that out for you here. We need to find f, g, d, and e so that fg is a, f times g is a, d times e is c, and fe plus dg equals b. And there's an additional condition there that they're all integers. So what you need to do is write out every way to factor a and every way to factor c, and then choose the factoring for each that gives the correct middle term coefficient, which is fe plus dg. Okay, since there's so many numbers involved, it's quite a few sometimes, we need a systematic way to go through them to organize your work so that you can tell whether you've tried every possibility or not. Sometimes you get a problem that doesn't factor with integers and you have to put doesn't factor. But you want to make sure that you checked every possibility before you decide that, not just everything you thought of, which is a totally different thing. And that's how a lot of people do these and get things wrong, is they only check the ones that they think of, and then they say, oh, doesn't factor, but there's 1 or 2 that they didn't think of, and one of those is the correct one. So you need a systematic way to make sure that you're checking all of them, all the possibilities. So there's several ways to do this, and I'm going to show you actually the way I was initially taught. And then, and this will be assignment A is, well, I organize it slightly differently than the book does. It's just the way we're writing stuff down, but it's the same idea. And they call it the guess and check method. Well, there's actually no guessing involved, so I'm not quite sure why they call it that, but maybe it'll make sense to you. And that's the part A of this section. It's assignment A. And then there's an assignment B, which uses what's called the AC method, which is a different method. Now, you might have done this before and learned a completely different method, because there's several different ones. And you can use that unless they're telling you to go through step by step doing a particular method. And then you have to be able to go through those steps properly. Okay. Okay. On tests, though, I usually just, I don't give you those kinds of problems on tests. I just say factor this completely, and then you can use whatever method you want, as long as it's one that works. Okay, so instead of writing factors of A and C horizontally like I did when the leading coefficient was 1, I write these vertically, because that way we can multiply across the pairs. You'll see what I mean in a minute. And also make all the signs positive in the list. That's just so you have half as many things in your list. So what I'm doing here is I wrote down what A is, that's the leading coefficient. And then underneath it, I write the different ways of factoring A. So A is going to be F1 times G1, or F2 times G2, etc. Right? So F1 times G1 equals A. F2 times G2 equals A. Right? And those are just positive integers. And then you do the same thing with C, but just using positive integers. Now C might be negative, but just make them both positive. And what you do is you put the sign of C in between A and C. And the reason I do that is because the sign will tell you whether you're adding or subtracting your products. You're going to have a product of one thing from the left with one thing from the right, and then the other thing from the left with the other thing from the right. And you need to know, do you add those products or do you subtract them? If C is negative, you put a negative in between these two, and that reminds you that you're subtracting. If C is positive, put a plus between these two, and that reminds you that you're adding the products. If that's not quite clear, I'll show you here. Of course, this is all in abstract. Remember, I'll do examples after this, or at least one example. I think I did 2 examples. So first, I draw these little lines between these, F1 to D1, G1 to E1. The line means you're multiplying those two. So I'm going to take F1 times D1 and G1 times E1. Then I'm going to add or subtract those depending on what the sign between A and C is. Okay, and you're trying to see if you get B, the coefficient of the middle term here. That one. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing with the 2 crossing. So instead of taking F1 times D1, I'm going to take F1 times E1 and G1 times D1, and then add or subtract those depending on what sign is here. Add or subtract those and see if you get the middle term B, the coefficient of the middle term B. If you don't, then you move on and you try these two with these two. So I tried these two with these two in the 2 possible ways, parallel and crossing. And those, if those didn't work, if one of those works, then I just use that. If it doesn't work, then I go down the first one on the left and the second one on the right, and you do parallel and crossing. And I'll do that with F1 and G1 all the way down until I run out of possibilities of ways of factoring C. If none of those work, then I'll start with F2, G2, and I'll do those with these top ones, parallel and crossing, see if any of those work, do them here, right? See if those work and keep going down. And you just repeat this until you get through all the possibilities. Okay, and if none of them work, then it doesn't factor with integers. Okay, and usually I don't draw these lines in, usually I don't draw these lines in until I find the one that works, and then I draw the lines. But I'm drawing them here so you can see what I'm doing, because I'm kind of doing this in my head, like, okay, that times that, minus that times that, no, it's the wrong number, that times that, minus that times that, no, it's the wrong number, etc. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and of course, you'll need to see some examples to probably to follow what I mean by all this. It might seem a little confusing at this point. But that's the basic idea.